This is the 50 Debian series, and in this case it'll be covering NLFs, or non-linear fortifications. I can feel the excitement that must be raising in your heart, but in all seriousness, you will always have one of these things in a typical larger game, and it's important to know how to use them and how to defeat them. I'll be honest, I did have a lot of issues in working this out, and there is a gap in the rules which require an assumption on my part. I will mention this when it comes to it, but another gamer confirmed the assumption that I used was correct. So I'm pretty certain it is the way that it is. The rules references will be visible in each slide. The slide's references use a version 2019 of the rules. Quick caveat, all distances are in centimetres, assuming you are using 15 mil of figures. The word player turn is used instead of the word bound. The word element is used instead of the word unit, which in the rules is a single base of figures. Just a quick note, this video, unlike my previous videos, is not a training video. It's actually a fairly in-depth study of a specifically point of the rules. Thus, beginners may probably be best not to view this until they've played several games, and it's really designed for players that want to use NLFs and are confused by the rules and wish to understand how to use them correctly. First point to cover is what is a non-linear fortifications. Case 563 states a NLF is a village that is no more than a few scattered buildings but not large enough or developed enough to be classed a BUA. Examples are such as Funtesta Unuro, Peninsula 1811, or a compact group of buildings or large wall farm complex such as Hougoumont, Waterloo 1815 are classed as NLFs. It can be depicted as a small building with a walled courtyard on a base 8 cm by 6 cm in size. At a scale of 1 in 2400, this represents an area of 144 metres by 192 metres, which would be a village of about 100 inhabitants, or at least it would be if it were talking about a village similar to where my father was brought up. This would consist of about 24 buildings. Whether or not this is what was intended is not really relevant, but I wanted to get my mind around what this was supposed to represent and the size the village would represent and how it would impede an advance or how it would be actually influencing a game. Incidentally, I'm assuming the buildings here would all be of stone because most villages of this size were built this way in Europe because it's really cold in Europe and that's just simply the way they built. I'm uncertain why the unusual size, however. Perhaps this represents a road running along the long axis with houses on each side, which would resemble possibly my father's village, although possibly not my mother's village. For myself, my built-up areas are squares, thus I normally deploy a 6 cm square or an 8 cm square to represent an NLF. I have experienced no issues with this, so I would assume that this is a viable dimension to use in a game. While all the examples in this video use the 6 cm by 8 cm rectangle as per the rules, I only ever use a square built-up area to represent NLFs, and it seems to work. NLFs have two modes, for want of a better word. These are: no element is formally occupying it. Elements can be in the NLF, but they have not been positioned around the perimeter for defence. The rule seems to indicate this by saying the element is inside the NLF. The second mode is an element is occupying it, which means the element is positioned along the perimeter to defend it. I'm wondering if the unusual size of 6 by 8 cm represents a large double-sized element, double with, let's say, 4 cm double to 8 cm, and more than double depth 3 cm to 6 cm, for example. The other explanation is this is used as possibly part of the front line, so players can choose the 6 cm or 8 cm frontage. It makes no difference, but this could explain the rectangle, which is used to represent the NLF. As an element represents a lot of troops from 2000 to 2500 and a significant depth, this would give you a solid line of troops all around the NLF, but with no depth. I personally feel the actual troop scale, based on the ground scale, is closer to half this, but even then we still have more than enough muskets to defend our small village. We'll first look at an unoccupied NLF, that is an NLF where an element is inside it and not actually defending the perimeter. An unoccupied NLF, or at least an element which is inside such an NLF, acts in a similar way or manner to area terrain, having a unique effect on movement and an effect on combat. The key takeaway from case 7.10 is an element in an NLF which is not occupying it is not scattered around the perimeter, so when engaged by an enemy element, only the element itself is considered to be defending. That is, you're actually combating element on element, you're not really combating the edge of the NLF. Case 563 makes it clear that an NLF is not considered as bad going for movement, but obviously this is not the case for combat. However, even though the NLF is not bad going, it's not the same as good going or a road. The maximum movement allowed, even if in march column, is 7.5 centimetres. I expect there is a road which goes through, but as you go through the NLF, you need to slow down. Perhaps congestion, sightseeing, or something is occurring which limits movement. Case 7.18 states an element first needs to move into the NLF before it can occupy it. But while it's in the NLF and not in an occupied state, it cannot fire outside the NLF. I expect this implies it's possible to fire inside the NLF at an enemy element, although we later discover this is unlikely. Any element in an NLF which is not occupying it cannot fire outside the NLF based on case 8.9 as well. Case 8.6 also states any element in a NLF which is not occupying it, that is defending the perimeters, cannot be subject to fire combat, except if by artillery on higher ground or a howitzer. This is logical as the element would be inside the NLF, protected by the buildings. Case 8.24 indicates that combat inside an NLF is classed as bad going. This only applies to combat where there is no element occupying the NLF. This implies that both fire and close combat can occur inside the NLF, although I'm uncertain if there is a visibility range limit, as in woods. I expect there is, and that, as we will later discover, no fire combat is possible within an NLF, so the visibility constraint is even more severe than a woods. Combat inside bad going gives you two modifiers, the -2, which is used for any attackers fighting in bad going, and the -1 if firing at Jagers in bad going. We also discovered that elements in an NLF cannot provide support, close support or fire support, I would assume, to elements outside the NLF. This is really quite logical, and there's even an explanation why that's the case. Finally, Rule 8.24 makes it comparatively clear that no form of support, either fire or close support, is permitted within the NLF. This seems extremely logical. Well, my conclusion so far is 1. No support is allowed. And as you can only move in a ZOC if intending to conduct combat, the image on the left is not permitted. On the right, the element on the flank is not providing support because it's not allowed. But it's not in a ZOC, so it can presumably be placed here. I have assumed it's considered to not be in contact, thus a recoil by the Prussian would not destroy that element. But this is only a guess on my part. It's a pretty unusual case, so I doubt it would ever occur. An unoccupied NLF is similar to woods for combat purposes, except the rules imply you can't deploy on the edge to fire out. Well, this is reasonable, as if you wish to do that, you would occupy the NLF, and as we discover later, you can't even fire within the NLF. Once in a NLF, elements can only move individually or in column, as in all bad going. As a result, you can attack an enemy element with the element on the flank, that is, you can attack the flank of an enemy element, but of course you can't use any support, remember that. It's not possible to use attack column in bad going, as per case 7523. I'm uncertain if the attacking element needs to be fully within the NLF, see case 8.11, but this seems to imply it's not a restriction. As long as you suffer the negative effects of being in bad going, you can engage in close combat. Now let's look at what occurs when the NLF is occupied by an element. First, we need to identify how we actually occupy an NLF. Case 7.18 gives us the procedure. Basically, fully move in the NLF and presto, next player turn, you are occupying the NLF. As you can imagine, only infantry can occupy an NLF. To unoccupy a NLF, we simply move out of the NLF as per case 7.18. I've rarely ever made an element leave an NLF, but as I normally use them for victory conditions, but if you do not, then it's something you may need to understand how to do, and it seems fairly clear and simple. The most common way of taking an NLF is to force the occupying defender to recoil. As an element which occupies an NLF is actually considering the NLF as a big element, a recoil result will require the element to leave the NLF, recoiling from the back base edge of the NLF. I assume the recoil is as per the standard recoil rules, and the element moves away from its attacker, which means if an enemy is waiting for it, the element could be destroyed. This is one of the big advantages of occupying an NLF. Remember, an element occupying an NLF is spread around its perimeters, so it fires from the edge of the NLF and can fire in all directions, with the only restriction noted in case 8.9 to take note of. The NLF basically becomes a big element. Because it's consisting of buildings, it could never launch a close assault, so it could only defend, but otherwise it's basically a big element. This is actually a very good way to extend the frontage of a normal element, which is 4 centimetres, to let's say 8 centimetres or 6 centimetres at a minimum in your front line. So it's a good way of expanding the ability of a single element to hold the enemy back. There are a couple of situations which I'm slightly unclear about, such as if you're the enemy which launches a close assault against an NLF and stays there, does the close combat continue during the NLF player's phasing turn? I assume it does, and I suspect that situation's pretty rare regardless. But otherwise, that's the conclusion I have at the present moment. Case 8.24 makes it reasonably clear that there are no additional restrictions when attacking an occupied NLF. This implies we could employ 2 supporting elements when attacking an enemy occupying an NLF. This also implies we can use an attack column. This shows an example close combat against the element occupying the NLF. I would have to assume the attacker can take advantage of support and attack columns if it had the additional elements to do so. An occupied NLF represents fortifications, similar to linear fortifications, which means light infantry get a +4 factor, and the defender gets a +1 against close combat, and the fire gets a -2 when firing into such a NLF formation or device or buildings. If this was the case, then you would need support bonuses to have any real good chance of dislodging an enemy element occupying an NLF. Let's look at the specific fortification rules to understand all the other rules associated with a element occupying an NLF, which is clearly a fortification. Let's deal with the edge cases, which, while are important, are generally not really in doubt. Elements occupying an NLF are considered as fortification, and as a result, the following rules would apply. Commanders can be classed as foot in fortification, so I'm assuming commanders can be actually used to occupy a NLF. Anyway, something for me to investigate. Guerrillas can occupy an NLF, but require a path of bad going in order to do so. This is also covered in the specific NLF rules covered previously. If engaged in close combat with an element occupying an NLF which recoils or is destroyed, the element must pursue into the NLF, and let's be honest, why wouldn't you? Now we come to the meaty rules concerning fortification, which is combat effects. The first is light infantry are rather effective in NLFs, which is quite reasonable. Elements occupying an NLF gain a +1 when defending against a close combat. Attackers suffer a -2 when conducting fire combat, with some minor exceptions, against elements occupying an NLF. Now let's compare fire combat and close combat against an NLF, or at least an element which is either inside an NLF but is not defending the perimeter, or an element which is occupying the NLF and is defending the perimeter. The first is that we need to agree that an element occupying an NLF should obtain some special additional benefit compared with an element that happens to be just inside it. If this is true, then we know our interpretations of the rules must be correct. The second is that we need to understand the modifier, the -2 modifier, for if any but foot skirmishers or IC, either in contact with enemy or firing within or into bad going, which is case 5512. When does it apply and when doesn't it apply? As the element occupying the NLF is clearly in a bad going and an attack being made into it or against the NLF, I would assume the modifier applies. But this only is the case if the element is inside and the combat is basically being carried out as if it was bad going. So it applies if it's not occupying, but if it's occupying it, this modifier does not apply. And I've had this confirmed by a more experienced player, so I'm pretty certain this interpretation is correct, so my thanks to that player. So, based on this, assuming these assumptions are correct, we can make the following statements concerning combat within an NLF. So if we look at these charts here, we can clearly see that occupying an NLF gives us additional benefits. Okay, what are these benefits? The first is trying to dislodge an enemy occupying an NLF using fire combat is very difficult, unless using a lot of artillery, which aligns with the rules designer's comments. This is due to the -2 if firing at infantry in fortification modifier. If the artillery happens to have 2 support elements, then yes, they could negate this and they would have a better chance of achieving their objectives. The second advantage is there is an additional +1 combat modifier or factor to overcome if conducting close combat against a NLF. Now, there is no possibility of obtaining a flank modifier to overcome this, so support or combat or attack column would be the mechanism that you would use to overcome it. Now, if we look at the modifiers for elements which are inside, not occupying but just inside, then the main occupier modifier is the -2 for fighting in bad going, which applies to both sides. So it doesn't really have much of a major effect, although it does increase the likelihood of a 2-to-1 result. So there is that particular effect. And of course, troop types, skirmishers do, or Jagers do quite well in bad going, for example. Now we come to the last section of this video, which is examples of how to fight in an NLF, both if the enemy is defending as an unoccupied NLF and an occupied NLF. We will start with an unoccupied NLF. Let's look at fire combat first, which requires some minor assumptions. We cannot conduct normal fire combat against an element not occupying an NLF unless we have artillery on higher elevation. This is actually quite likely, as artillery has a range of 25 centimetres, and it's pretty likely there will be a hill within that range. So let's investigate how easy or otherwise it is using artillery to take out an element which is in an NLF but is not occupying it. To get a recoil, a single artillery element would need to spin a 3 or more than the defender, which is a low probability outcome, only 1 in 6 chance of happening. You may on average obtain a favourable result in 3 fire combats. The good thing, of course, is the artillery is safe from the consequences of such a fire combat. Now, if the artillery uses fire support, and I have to assume this is possible, and this is the assumption that I'm making, then we could have 2 other pieces of artillery, 2 other elements, to give us a +2, which means we can negate the -2, and then we get a good probability of causing a recoil. Now, of course, why would you do this? Possibly to stop the element from occupying the NLF, perhaps. But the trouble is that if you get a recoil, it only recoils 2 centimetres, so it could probably still remain in the NLF. Unless, of course, the rules imply that if you get a recoil, even if you're not occupying it, you have to recoil from the NLF, which I suspect is probably really the correct interpretation of the rules. Let's look at a specific example, French foot artillery versus foot. We have a FCF of 3. Let's say we spin a 6, which is the best possible result, modifiers -2, result is 7. The Prussian musket versus foot. Let's say the Prussian musket spins an average die roll, which is 3. It has an FCF of 4, which means its result is 6. The French wins 7-6 or 1.2-1. The Prussian recoils. Okay, what happens if the Prussian only spins a 1? Well, it's 6, it drops to 4. You can never get a 2-1 result in this case, unless, of course, you have support. The other method of clearing an NLF of infantry, which is not occupying it, is to go in there and conduct close combat. Now, I'm not 100% certain what happens when you recoil in this case. Do you recoil entirely from the NLF, or do you only recoil 2 centimetres within the NLF, as if you would in any other bad going, such as woods? Let's assume you only recoil 2 centimetres in this particular case. So worst case is the defender is on the edge, which means the attacker needs to get 3 recoils to get him out of the NLF. As I said, I'm not exactly certain what the actual interpretation of the rules are, but let's go with this at the present moment. Now, as both sides get a -2 modifier, because they're fighting in bad going, there is actually a good chance the attacker would win, resulting in the enemy recoiling. The issue with the -2, or the only real difference with the -2, is the die roll becomes more important, so there is a slightly higher chance of a 2-to-1 result, 1 in 12 chance actually. If the attacker wins, the defender goes back 2 centimetres, the attacker pursues and needs to repeat this additional 2 times to clear the NLF. This is not going to clear the NLF particularly easily or well, so we need to use a different strategy, and the best strategy is to get around the flanks and get a +1 modifier. Now, of course, you can't use support, so really what the objective here is that you're attempting to pin the enemy musketeer while you get a guy around the flank to go in, and then for one of the close combats, it's the flank guy that hits the Prussian in the flank, gets a +1 and increases his chance of victory. And actually the chance of a 2-to-1 really goes up. Nonetheless, this is probably the best way of clearing an NLF, that is, going in there with elements. Incidentally, you can't use close support, and you can't use attack column in this particular situation. Let's now look at what happens when we're trying to clear an occupied NLF. I find light infantry possibly could be the best troop type to go into a NLF and occupied. It has the same combat factor occupying an NLF as a musket, and it has greater fire combat range. Jager has even greater range, but it's easier to dislodge, but is a valid option nonetheless. We may ask ourselves, why should we even bother to occupy an NLF? You know, apart from it being in the front line and you need to crack that front line, this is the other reason. If you have a light infantry in NLF, it can actually conduct fire combat 7.5 centimetres in all direction, which gives this position the ability to affect a large part of the front line, up to 23 centimetres across the front line. While such an element may not have much effect when firing normally, if the attacker bypasses the position, it could get shot at from the flank or rear, which would have a bigger effect. If it were a musket element, its range reduces to 5 centimetres in all direction, but it has a greater combat factor and is probably more difficult to remove from the NLF. I also use these positives positions as objectives for victory conditions. While very heavy troop casualties is a good trigger for a withdrawal and an end of game, as occurs in the standard game, I find geographical objectives force players to do something rather than cowering in a highly defensive position, and thus I always use them. Let's look at artillery's ability to clear the pesky NLF. While it may not suffer the -2 for firing into a bad going, there is a -2 for firing an infantry in fortification, which means there's no basic difference in terms of modifiers. This is, reasonable. This is a viable strategy if you have a single element firing away, but it's not really going to clear the NLF unless you can fire at it with a lot of artillery. So if you have 2 supporting artillery elements, then the job is a lot easier. One other big advantage is you don't need to be on higher elevation. As long as you've got a line of sight to the NLF, you can start pounding away with your artillery. So 3 pieces of artillery pounding away should be able to clear that NLF pretty quickly. The other method is to use musket troops to conduct fire combat, which may not be such a good idea. The fire suffers a -2 while the defender does not, so the chance of victory is low, is rather low, but the big problem is you could be affected by the fire combat, and it's not a good thing to be affected. If you use light infantry, which have a greater range, then you could fire from a greater range, so there's no possible effect. But if the defenders are light infantry, this strategy is mute, unless you use Jager. Really, the best way here is if you use support. So if I was going to try and clear this with fire combat, I would always make sure I'd have 2 elements supporting my fire combat, and then it just simply becomes an even combat against the enemy. Reasonably viable to clear, but probably not the best way to clear this particular element from this location. The final method, of course, is close combat, which is probably my preferred way of clearing an NLF, unless of course you use a grand battery, but that's an awful lot of firepower to waste on just clearing one of these suckers. Okay, if we have this, in this particular example, we have an element trying to use a close combat to clear an NLF which is occupied. Now, you don't suffer the -2 for being in bad going, but the defender does get a +1 for when defending fortification. If they're light infantry, their base combat factor also rises to 4, but let's just assume it's musket versus musket. Now, in this case, the attacker needs to spin a 2 or better in order to win, which is basically to cause a recoil, which is just short of a 1/3 chance. The big advantage is that in this particular case, if the element is forced to recoil, it actually leaves the NLF and recoils 2 centimetres from the NLF. So a single recoil will clear it and the attacker can move in. Now, you can use support elements in this particular case, and the optimal strategy is to use at least 1 support, if not 2 support, and you can even use attack column. So close combat with enough element should be able to easily clear an NLF, and that's probably the best way of doing it quickly if that's what you need to do. If you're lucky enough to have someone to teach you the rules, then that's the best way of learning. But if you lack this, then the only way to learn is to carefully read the rules and create scenarios to test out your interpretation of the rules. This will either be simple because the rules are clear, or difficult because the rules will be unclear, incomplete, or scattered around the rules book. Then you have to use assumptions, which requires trying to understand what intentions the designers had, and it's not a good way of understanding rules. One technique I use is to duplicate all the rules concerning a problematic topic together, which allows me to see all the rules in some form of holistic manner. This lists all the NLF rules which relate to elements in an unoccupied NLF. This lists all the rules which relate to elements in an NLF which is occupying the NLF. The case numbering is my own, and it's basically aligned with the standard rules numbering. So this is an addendum summary immediately after case 563. The final piece of the puzzle are all the rules relating to fortification, specifically when it relates to an occupied NLF. I must admit there are not many puzzles like this in the rules, and I freely admit all sets of rules have the same type of issues. Cross-referencing assists, but if the number of rules which need to be cross-referenced is large, even this does not help. I often find brief examples assist greatly when faced with this type of conundrum, which I once again reiterate is common to all sets of rules. This concludes my Part 5 DBN training video, in this case providing an in-depth view of NLFs and how they are used. This is not a beginner's video, and my apologies for the assumptions I have used rather than providing specific rules references to prove them, but I have always used NLFs in my games as I use them for victory conditions, and I had to really sort out all the details in order to have any kind of game. And I found this topic more complex than I originally expected. BUAs, for example, are a lot simpler. This video is based on my examples, a book for DBN, which can be found in the Kriegspiel.io group site. Just go to File, Napoleonic Rules, and select DBN. You will find it there. Denken Sie daran, immer für Heil, heimatlichen zu kämpfen.